Hello, my name is Adam Bean and welcome to the 56th edition of RxTV. So let's start with the content. So first, autumn events. A lot is going on. Tomorrow I'm going to be at the WJAX conference in Munich, and I will present twice. Once about monitoring and JakartaEE and MicroProfile monitoring, and then about architectures. Then next week I'm going to be in Bern in Switzerland and will implement on stage I will hack something on stage. And something means some best practices with JakartaEE and MicroProfile. Then 3 days later, I'm going to be at DevOps in Belgium. And what I will do is similar to Bern, without the cloud. So what I will do is I will show you some JakartaEE on MicroProfile goodness, and what I would like to show you what happens if we combine MicroProfile with JakartaEE and WebStandards. This is also a slideless show, and of course some AirHacks workshops. And the AirHacks workshops are interesting because they are almost sold out. So let's take a look at the situation here. So this is the first 2 days are almost exception overflow. So we have attendees overflow exception. The migrations from Swing, I think we have 5 registrations. So there is something. So we have more room here, but I still think that we have a smaller room than the other days. So there will be 2 to 3 attendees or seats left. And if you cannot attend both, you could attend the Swing, because what I'm going to do is to briefly discuss Swing architecture, MVC, and how to port that to web. So it is also interesting if you are not a Swing or JavaFX developer. And then, of course, we will have the 4 days in a row, starting with MicroProfile in JakartaEE, like a basics, then architectures, microservices, and performance troubleshooting and monitoring. And what happens is I'm going to extend this JavaEE 8 performance troubleshooting and monitoring part with a little bit more Grafana and Prometheus, because I got lots of questions about that. So the agenda is going to be enhanced even more, and also cover some Docker monitoring, Docker alerting, and log analysis tools. Okay, so we covered that. Now, what else? Now let's go to the podcast right away. So meanwhile, I recorded 2 podcasts, and there are a lot more in the pipeline. One is with Josh Marinacci, and you can probably even know Josh from the early Swing days. He wrote the Swing book and was one of the core team at Sun. And so we had a chat about the old Swing days, and also Josh is working now for Mozilla, and then we moved the conversation towards 3D virtual reality and web standards, and also interesting. So this is the last episode of Airhacks FM was with Tobias Sasse, and Tobias is an Airhacks alumni, and he implemented an interesting, or he participated in an interesting project at IBM. This was like cognitive elder care, where they deployed sensors in the flats or houses of elderly people, and so that people could stay at home, and if something went bad, they were alerted. So the whole architecture was with clouds, Watson, and of course JavaEE and MicroProfile. So if you're interested in architectures, yeah, just listen to the podcasts. Okay, this is what, and there are some interesting podcasts in the queue. So let's see what happens here. Now, now back to the questions, or to questions to the topics. And the next airhacks.com is going to be in April, I guess. So there will be from January to March, there's a lot to do. So the next installment, or the next edition of Airhacks at Munich Airport is going to be in April 2019. Okay, now at CodeONE, this was interesting. At CodeONE conference, I delivered a few sessions. This interactive onstage hacking is interesting if you don't know MicroProfile in JakartaEE. So I showed the attendees what happens if you combine both. But there was a long requested topic about BCE pattern, And what I did, I spent one hour with boundary control entity, and I had a lot more stuff to cover than actually planned. So there were no slides and also no code, almost no code. So I just focus on the basic structure, how to structure JavaEE and MicroProfile microservices. I got a lot of questions about that, and so now I delivered. So I took the opportunity and spent one session spent 1 hour or 45 minutes discussing this. Okay, and of course there was one full show about web standards. Okay, now to the topics. The first true topic from the show is JavaONE versus CodeONE, and what I did, I prepared a small movie. So I arrived early at JavaONE or CodeONE, so early. I couldn't sleep because of jet lag. So I was one of the first speakers or attendees at CodeONE, and the CodeONE happened in at Moscone. So I had took the opportunity and recorded a short movie, and it was basically on 2 levels. The first level was the expo, there was vendor expo, and then we had our sessions, and as you can see, our JavaONE Duke at CodeONE conference. Now, as you can see, live for the code. This is the quite interesting slogan, and here is the expo with a robot, and this was the groundbreaker show, which I was also interviewed by Java, so it was a really funny interview. And there was actually a big expo with lots of content, and this was the keynote which I attended. It was in Moscone North, I believe, with GitHub, and of course GitHub loves Java because Microsoft also loves Java. There are lots of attendees, so I'm really curious what happens next year, whether all the attendees will come back. Keynote was interesting, covering some Java 12 as well as covering the LTS support for Java 12.
Thank you, George.
And
hello, everyone, and welcome.
LTS strategies from Oracle. This is Mark Reinhold, one of the chief architects from the from Java.
I'd like now to focus on
he's one of the early experts.
Now we have
back to the expo. This is JavaFX running on iOS as well as on Android from Johan Voss. So I also interviewed Johan on the AirHack show.
And we can tap the Duke.
It shows here
Let's bring us back to
AR
JavaFX 3D
and
application.
AR kit.
Did you hack it yesterday night?
iOS or Android.
Actually, this morning. Had no time yesterday night.
If I'm at CodeONE, we also take the opportunity to chat a little bit, and he will also attend DevOps. So now this is this is the other perspective from the groundbreakers.
Nice.
This is a DJ who was able who recorded or programmed music instead of it's like a live programming show. So JavaONE was quite interesting, I would say. So now, what's my impression? So I think it is. I mean, CodeONE this year was very similar to JavaONE last year. Was the same building, similar sessions. I really enjoyed the technical content. I only spent 2 days at CodeONE, so not the whole week. So I had to work afterwards in my project. So I didn't have too much time this year. And my impression is, so it was there was actually no distinction to last year. It's also great. But I don't think renaming JavaONE to CodeONE is a good idea. So why not? Because I think the branding of JavaONE was perfect. So JavaONE was like, everyone knows JavaONE. It's like the perfect brand for a conference, right? And CodeONE, I liked the name, of course. CodeRools, CodeONE is a great name. But what I think what happens is lots of enterprise developers from USA and Canada and will not will no more, or from all over the world actually, will no more attend JavaONE because of the name changes. I think they will say, okay, CodeONE might be too broad, it's just another conference. So JavaONE was special, CodeONE is no more special. I would say it competes just with DevOps and all the other conferences, right? And what I think what would be a better idea to have the CodeONE like umbrella conference, and they have a lot smaller conference inside the CodeONE. Actually, JavaONE, there could be Rust1, you know, or Go1, JavaScript1, or Web1, or whatever one. And because right now there's everything and nothing. I like that. I would like to attend next year, but I'm really curious how many attendees will drop next year. Oh, we could even get more attendees. What I'm also curious about is how many fresh developers will attend CodeONE because there is no more Java in there. This would be interesting statistics. So now, stop with the fluffy stuff, and I will start with the first question: how to store secrets. So oh wow, Zotsia ask me. Thanks for hosting an opportunity for questions, of course. So, and he builds a Java server socket app, and he would like to store secrets, and he can encrypt the password. The problem, of course, is where to store the private key. So I tell you about a trick, and the trick is from Cloud Native. What usually happens is there are tools like Vault, for instance, Vault or etcd, and what they're doing, they're injecting the passwords or the credentials into environment entries and then removing this afterwards. So of course, if you could, have access to the memory, you could read the password, because in one point of time it has to be in clear text, but it's a way safer to store it in somewhere. So what you could, if this is a Docker app, what you could do, you could pass the password to the Docker app using environment entries or password private key. This is what I meant, private key. And you can decrypt it inside your application, because you can access the private key with, you can access the environment entries and so your private key with systemenv. Next one. Objective is to prevent other transaction inside in a row in a table during another transaction is manipulated on the data. First, connection set transaction isolation can be done with JDBC, and the same can be done with JPA, because JPA uses JDBC. And what you can do, you can set up the transaction serialization level on data source. So all application servers I know allow you to set that. So you have to switch to application server, go to data source, and let's see whether my Payara is running. Could be 4848. No, unfortunately. So so otherwise, if you go to Payara, for instance, or Whitefly, or whatever application server you have, go to data source, and you will be able to set the isolation level. Also in JPA, you can specify the locking, and you can specify like a pessimistic lock on the entity manager. So the entity manager will also lock. Of course, it doesn't work very well in clusters, or not even clusters, if you have multiple instances of the same server behind a load balancer. Okay, the next one. How to implement data and internationalization for REST API server. I mean, this is nothing special with REST API server, because if you think about this, what a REST API server is, it just gives you back some JSON data. So what you will have to do is, you will have to find out in which language the user expects the data. And how to do that, I think you will have to use JSON Web Token, where you can, for instance, encode the preferred language, because JSON Web Token has an own payload area. And with MicroProfile JWT, you can even inject the data to your JAX-RS. If you don't have JSON Web Token, you will have to use some kind of API key, and you can use the API key to store some profile data on the server and to look up the preferred language of the user. And then the question is it a static or not? What do you mean by data internationalization for REST API? Is it just static data? Then you can use just stock internationalization from Java. Is the data dynamic? You will have to use you will have to use database, or yeah, you will have to read it from database, data store, something which stores the data dynamically. So you will have to look up the data. Okay, now Tobias Asse, by the way, this is the Tobias with whom I performed the Airhacks FM podcast interview, and also the interviewed him on my blog. He's from IBM, but extremely pragmatic project, really thin wars with microservices. So now you develop an application like GitHub hosted in the cloud. So, and he would like to offer an on-premise version of the GitHub Enterprise for premium clients. So, and now what is the best way to ensure that users have a valid license and remain in the negotiated constraints like number of servers and users? So, first, how to implement such a constraints. So how constraints means what the user can do or not do with or without license. In one project, we use security for that. So one role was licensed user or not a licensed user, and the licensed user could do things which a guest couldn't do. So this is one idea you could follow. Now the question is how to enforce such standards. So the question is it worth to enforcing it at all? So what I would do is I would implement something like high watermark and make it queryable. So because I think the best idea is to trust your users. I think no big enterprise will still steal, you know, your resources from your services, something like this. And if they really would like to do it, they will do it anyway. So it's really hard to prevent hacking. So what I will do is to record high watermark, make it queryable, and say, hey, client, look, you had a license for 10 users and you are serving, you know, 100 users. So this could be, I think this would be the best solution. And of course, what you could do, you could because each microservice runs on a dedicated application server instance, what you could easily do is to configure differently. You can say, okay, I can reduce the size of the queue of the thread pool or JDBC connection pool, because you can configure whatever you like with OpenLiberty, Wi-Fi, or Payara. So with JavaEE, it's really easy to achieve. Okay, now, Noherzek asked me, you have been talking about using platform for web applications without frameworks. This is not only talking, this is what I'm doing. I find this is a really nice way to go, but I have few questions. And the questions are, what about uglifying sources? So uglification is nice, but in Chrome, there is one, we have Chrome here. So if we are in the sources and I click, for instance, let's say, I will need here a JS. This is uglified, and I click here. It is still uglified, but at least readable. And if I spend some time, I will see what's going on here, because it's not that hard to understand. So it is really hard to make a code unreadable. So of course, if someone doesn't know this button, won't click it, so then it is almost unreadable. So if you click on here, so it is a pretty print and it is more readable. So with uglification, it will rename the constants to something uglier and make the code a little bit shorter and more concise. So actually you could skip that. Cache busting suffixes and concatenations where there is no HTTP2 support. Actually, what I did in the recent workshop, this is the effective web workshop, I implemented a short app with WebStandards, and at the end, what I used is a tool called Rollup, and this is a really interesting tool, yeah, built with Rollup, and what it does, it concatenates all the files. It understands ES6 module syntax, so the tool can be used from command line without npm, and it will concatenate all the files. What I did in this workshop, I implemented a router with lazy loading of views, and then used Rollup to find the files. And then I switched to static version and also use Rollup to concatenate the files. And with Rollup, you can have plugins. They can uglify. You could even integrate Babel. By the way, this is one of my to-dos to record a bonus show about Rollup with plugins. Okay, So everything can be achieved with rollup, but it's optional. And another interesting build tool, so a rollup.js. This is one. Exactly. And parcel.js is more like convention of a configuration, but the I used rollup because rollup comes plain with just concatenation, and parcel.js comes out of the box with lots of plugins. And for me, it was easier to add the plugins on demand than remove all the plugins here, because I didn't need that much build system. But look at parcel.js and rollup, and you can still go with WebStandards. So it is very easy, and actually use them in the effective web workshop. Okay, cool. Next one. So Dimpile asked me if we consider context of large application with thousands of users. So I think thousands of users is almost everything. So it's not like, and this is not very large, I would say. And is it more suitable from lots of forms? This is an interesting hint, because lots of forms means the next question would be where the forms are validated, on the server or on the client. And is it more suitable from performance perspective to use JSF or using a front-end JavaScript-based framework like React? So actually, parts of eBay were JSF, and they have at least thousands of users. So you can absolutely go with JSF. I think from performance perspective, you will need more memory, because with JSF something happens on the server, and with React and Angular, per default, nothing has to happen on the server, because you could even implement an offline app. What I did in the web standard app, I built a stocks app, which was completely offline, and so there was indefinitely scalable. Of course, now imagine this: you are implementing you have lots of forms. Let's say you would like to validate on field leave, and you would like to validate on the server. Then what can happen is that actually JSF could perform better than any client-side framework, because it is more optimized for that. But if you don't have to validate on each field, React and all the other client-centric frameworks will perform better. Even Swing or JavaFX will perform better than, or a native app will perform better than JSF. So if we use React or Angular, so my personal point of view, I wouldn't suggest you to use Angular. It's like huge framework. If you like to use React. So I think it is more pragmatic than Angular. And server-side rendering or client-side rendering. I mean, on the client, you will have to render anyway. You can use client's server-side rendering, but I would see it as optimization. I wouldn't start with server-side rendering, assuming it is too slow. And in fact, I never used server-side rendering with React. What I sometimes did, we used stock JSPs, which pre-rendered. It is like kind of server-side rendering, of course. Just take a look at JSPs, plain JSPs. They are just perfect for server-side rendering. Okay. And now the second part of the question is actually the next question is, there's an architecture where JSF talks via REST. So the backing beans talks via REST to a JAX-OS resource, which talks to EJB. Is it a good architecture or not? This is a good architecture for migration, because then you can replace JSF with React or Angular. The problem is, of course, it causes lots of overhead, because the JSF will have to communicate with the backend resources all the time. So this is unnecessary remote calls. And with JSF, you have the unique opportunity to run in, or JSF runs in the same memory as your CDI beans and EJBs. So you can directly access the methods, which is actually great and very productive. Okay, and now the Drools is a business rule management system. So you could use Drools, but before you look at a rule management system, just look at NASWAN or GraalVM. You can just execute whatever, or just plain JSR 223 is like scripting integration in JavaEE. This is in lots of cases absolutely sufficient to have a fluid logic. Jumarom asked me, how do you see the future of GraphQL or GraphQL? Do you think it could be the new standard for development of web APIs? So what is GraphQL? GraphQL is like query by example. You can send from the server or from the client like a template to the server, and the server knows how to query that or how to give you the results. So it was query by example, I think was called in Hibernate. Now it is not more that popular, I would say. It could be, I'm not sure about the web API. So if you have really complex UI, GraphQL could really simplify things. But I would say the minimum requirements would be to have at least 2 teams, backend and front-end teams. So the GraphQL could provide you a more productive environment. Web APIs, I think GraphQL is not exactly. It is RESTful, but it doesn't expose, the business concept to the outside world. So I think GraphQL is really interesting just if you're building a UI, and not that interesting to expose a nice business web API. So I have to develop a new web for a company in which I will be the only developer. Perfect. So you have at least 1 pizza team. So I already know JSF, JE, and also JavaScript. And he's new, and you are new, and I am new in the world of web components and single-page applications. Based on that, in the fact that time is not a constraint, should I go with JSF? Time is not a constraint. This is important. Should I go with JSF or with web standards and web components? Now, you are listening to Airhacks, and so you are interested at least in software development. And from this particular point of view, I would go with web standards and web components. You would learn the most from your perspective. And even you could use Prime Faces UI or Vaadin elements as web components and integrate them to your application. So even your old, or your old JSF knowledge is not entirely lost. But if you have no specific requirements and you are free from the user interface perspective, if there are no constraints, I think JSF would be the most productive. So in environment, if the application is not that sophisticated, I think with JSF your productivity would be unbeatable. But if time is not a constraint, I personally would choose web components and web standards, because then you learn something for life. Okay. Now, Seba Garcia writes, "Hi Adam, I read your blog post about EJB with or without CDI." So it's older one. Now with JavaEE 8, do you think we still need EJBs? Yes, it's still the simplest possible component architecture. In terms of scalability, what scales better? EJBs. So we had several times. Take a look at Samolisov EJB versus CDI, and you will find a nice, interesting benchmark on GitHub. And you will find that EJB, in terms of performance, are the best, and from and scalability perspective, the performance is the best, the overhead is the least. So they should be also come with the best scalability. And yeah, exactly. CDI means with transactional methods or EJBs. So the problem is you could do whatever you like with CDI, but you will have to put more annotations on your class. And with EJBs, you would just put at stateless. So I would prefer less and look simpler and is less cluttered. But you could absolutely go with just transactional. You will achieve similar perspective. It depends on CDI implementation, but it is usually slower. Why that? EJBs are pooled, and pools means the whole injection tree is injected only once. And in CDI, it is injected once if this is a singleton, or per request scope for every request once. So the direction which profile I was going. Do you know if there is a side table that shows which feature is implemented in which application server? Of course, I will push it tomorrow after your request. I will create MicroProfile runtime support. I implemented a JSON file, which is initial step. So I found information about Payara, Whitefly, and Tommy and Open Liberty. And we'll create a small web components based app, which you can launch, and you will get your table. So if you check it out tomorrow or this week, it should be already implemented, and you can check out the app. You will have to launch browser sync, and you will see the results. So I have problems to use lit HTML with Edge. Have you tried with Edge? No, I don't have that requirements. I'm in the lucky situation. Whatever I do right now are enterprise applications. Soon I will start with an internet project, but in my current projects are enterprise, and we are allowed to use Chrome, which is great. So in lit HTML, I have already Shadow DOM and Web Components polyfill in place. This is lit HTML doesn't need that. Lit HTML is not based on Shadow DOM. It only needs a DOM element. So I think if you have problems with Edge, Edge has problem with the new JavaScript syntax used in lit HTML, and then I would take a look at Babel. The Shadow DOM and Web Components polyfills has nothing to do with lit HTML. Lit HTML can be even used without Web Components. And by the way, in recent projects, we used Web Components with Edge, but we didn't use lit HTML. Exactly. How I write Jenkins file, I rely on the, how it's called, not the scripting syntax, rather than DSL script syntax. And what I don't have the problem, my Jenkins file are not that complicated. For instance, take checkout in unit test and build. It looks exactly like this. I have more stages, but the stages are that simple. So this is actually my syntax. Exactly. And if there is something complex to do, sometimes I use shell scripts, which are loaded externally. They are easier to implement, so there's complete external script, but usually it looks like this. So thanks, and see you again in December. So then we can, talk about that as well. So I use this script, this syntax without relying too much on the, I think it's called actions or scripts, where you can embed, logic inside. Now, Mihai Husem asked me, what do you prefer, Hibernate or Eclipse Link as a JPA vendor? Both are great. Yeah, Hibernate and Eclipse Link both are good. What I try to avoid is OpenJPA. And which one them you use in production apps? In Payara, I use Eclipse Link, and in Whitefly, Hibernate. Why most of European companies use Spring Framework instead of JavaEE? Because, I don't know. Because they look for Spring developers and not for JavaEE. There was a conference recently called JCon in Düsseldorf, and I had the opportunity to deliver the keynote. And what I did, I started with, I think, Payara, MicroProfile, and JavaEE 7, and then switched to OpenShift and deployed some apps with Whitefly and load balancer and so forth. And attendees came to me afterwards and they asked me, what you did, what was it? It was like incredible, very fast and very lean. And they couldn't believe that that this was JavaEE. And then they told me that their architecture is crazy, like they built 50 layers and it didn't work. And then they switched to Spring, but after switching to Spring, they deleted all the layers. So it means it was not like fault of JavaEE. So I think this is a little bit the problem. Like in J2E world, there were lots of crazy architects which prescribed lots of empty patterns without any added value. And Spring was like the solution, I would say, the developer's way to escape the crazy architectures, I would say. But I don't know. I would say Spring and MicroProfile and JavaEE, in my eyes, are similar, actually. And by the way, if you search for IBM Open Liberty MicroProfile versus Spring, you will. They are investigated right now. IBM investigates Spring versus JavaEE and what is more productive and easier to understand. Okay, so don't ask me. What I can tell you, whatever I do is JavaEE. And my clients like it, and developers like that as well. Vagelis asked me, I'm working on a project where we have too many relationships with main JPA entities. So it seems like there's the core entity and all the entities pointing to this entity. And he would like to split it up. The question is how to do this. So you can always split it up. And what you will do then, you will have to replace the relationship with a query. So you could have like, let's say the main entity is the client and the satellite entity is the order. So you can always, go to the client microservice and say, give me the client for the ID 1. Either it happens automatically with the entity, or you will have to expose the query interface. So you can always split this. If you split this to different microservices, you have to go through the network, and you cannot use optimizations like fetch joins, batch fetches, and stuff like that. If you are in the same application, you are more monolithic, of course, harder to understand, but potentially really fast. And so I would say don't split don't introduce microservices because you can. You always have to have a reason for that. And microservices come with a price, of course. Okay. I hope it's answered. So next one. I want to migrate JSF in the future. Should I use an existing framework like Vue.js? I would start with WebStandards. Point, because this is what I do more and more, and I'm more and more convinced that WebStandards is the way to go. Even better, I got lots of developers which tried that, and feedback was great. That they told me, okay, this was a really good decision, because now they have a clear path what to do, and there was no added value of the frameworks. And there's also a huge misunderstanding. In last project, we had a discussion with project lead because he wanted to have Angular. And what turned out, what the project lead believed is that Angular comes with ready-to-use visual components. And he expected if you will use Angular, the UI would be more coherent. This is like reusable components, which is, of course, not true at all. So instead of... yeah, I would start with WebStandards. Done. So the next one, what about RxJava? This is like reactive programming. So is it better than use asynchronous annotations? No, asynchronous is first is the simplest possible thing. The next one is managed executor service. Then you can use JAX-RS with Rx, which introduces reactive programming, which is absolutely compatible with RxJava. So what you could even do with Java 7, you could use, if you're calling with JAX-RS client a service, you could use Rx implementation from RxJava if you really like or would like to do this. So this is possible. Now, what I'm doing, I'm trying to implement request response synchronous communication first. Then I measure the performance and scalability, and then see what happens. And if the application behaves well, I'm done. If not, then I would start with asynchronous. The only trouble with asynchronous is usually there is one thread pool which handles all the asynchronous tasks, and there is not a lot of flexibility to assign different thread pools for that. For smaller microservices, it's just fine. If the microservices grows larger, I either inject managed executor service, or with MicroProfile, you can introduce bulkheads. Okay, so my answer is try with synchronous first. If the performance is not good enough, then experiment with asynchronous. But asynchronous does not come for free. Let's say you have a slow method. If you do it asynchronous, it is going to be fast until the queue becomes full. So if it is constantly too slow, it does not help. If the queue is unbounded, you will get out of memory error. If the queue is bounded, it will be as slow as it was before after a while, and the latency is going to be higher. So now Robert Nistroy asked me, so in the YouTube video, I said that you should introduce a base image for Docker for cross-cutting concerns like POE. And the question is, do you mean by that JBoss deployment structure? Yes, something like this. For instance, what you could do, you can put JDBC drivers. What we did, we just shipped with the Docker image JDBC drivers for Payara. With JBoss or Whitefly, you will have to introduce a module sometimes in order to have it in class path, and then use scoped as provided in order to make it compile. Absolutely true. Orlovsky Java Prophy asked me what's my opinion about Red Hat and IBM merge, which probably will happen. First, I think Red Hat and IBM are really compatible companies. And IBM the last time was great. I know lots of developers, Open Liberty developers, and this is like a great open crowd. The same is true for Red Hat. And the only thing is, so Red Hat has Whitefly, which is great. IBM has Open Liberty, which is not even better, but as great as Whitefly. And what I'm a little bit afraid is if they both are merging, what can happen, one of the servers could die. And what this means, we have less server runtimes, which is always a pity. So we will get probably something like Pyara and then Open Liberty or Whitefly, depends who will win. And who wins really depends on, you know, marketing skills from project leads, I would say. Okay, now the next question is, the first version of JakartaEE would be backwards compatible with JavaEE, but what will happen after that? I saw discussion of Google mailing list, and the majority of people wish to drop some technology, EJB, JMS. I wanted to drop SOAP, but they wanted to keep it. I'm not afraid about JMS because there was a session about JMS 3.0 at CodeONE. I would actually kill EJBs if we get the same behavior in CDI. And by the way, don't be afraid about the Google mailing list, because the Google mailing list is just nice discussions, and what really happens depends on the umbrella spec. And if you would like to know how the JakartaEE process operates, listen to the podcast with Mike Milinkovic. I asked him this question to know how who decides what comes into JakartaEE and what not, and this is the umbrella specification, the JakartaEE specification, and you will have to have a seat in the advisory board. And you can get it by paying money or having commit rights. Okay, or either by money or by good work. Okay, exactly. So be active and participate in the process, and just write some blog posts and participate in discussion. So next one, Omega09 asked me, if an exception error occurs in JAX-source method on the server, the stack trace is turned to the client. What you can do to prevent that? First, throw an application which extends web application exception, put application exception annotation on it, and stack trace will disappear. I'm using H2 in memory database during development for my JPA entities. How can I view the tables during runtime? I think you can connect only once. If the JPA entity manager connects, it's actually over. So you cannot view them at runtime because they will disappear afterwards. What you could do, you could just switch to the file-based system. So you can do it both. Or if you use, for instance, Derby, you can switch between in-memory and file-based. But even in file-based embedded mode, you can only connect once. So what you could do, switch to file-based mode, and after the test, reopen that with a database viewer, JDBC Explorer, and look at the tables. 2 hours ago, so it's pretty new. Let's see. Ulrich Zech, I interviewed Ulrich on my I think he participated in the AirHacks and also performed an interview with him. He asked me a short question about BC structuring with multiple implementation of given domain aspect. Given the case, there is some payment feature in an application, and the payment can be performed via different payment providers. So basically, I would have business payment, BCE, but inside it will have payment provider A, B, and so forth. Okay, I got it. So you have a payment, and then you get PayPal payment and Amazon payment and so forth. All payment providers should have the same. So there is an abstract payment provider, so the concrete payment controllers only need to implement their specific API implementation of the specific payment provider. Would be correct to structure the packages as following. So first, business, payment, boundary, payment resource. Perfect. Business, payment, control, abstract payment. Yes. Business, payment, payment provider A, lowercase, control. Or I think it would be also correct to have the payment provider A, it would be like PayPal on the same level as payment. It doesn't have to be a sub thing. And also, I don't think you will have 50 payment providers. I would say you have probably 5 or no more than 5, then from my perspective, it will be absolutely okay to just put the PPA and PPB controllers into the same package as the payment. So you will have to payment control, abstract payment controller, then payment control, PayPal controller, control Amazon controller, and so forth. But usually you will not have more than 5. Then you will have 5 more classes in one package and it's done. This substructuring also works for me, but I don't think it is worth, because this is like a subsystem. You have some subsystem payment. There's no more a component rather than a subsystem. And inside the payment subsystem, we get Amazon, PayPal, and so forth. So this would also work for me. Now, we are done, and see you at the, or hear you at EHEX FM. And the podcasts with about JakartaEE is Mike Milinkovic. This is this one. And see you at airhex.com. This is at Munich Airport. And with web apps essentials, effective web apps. And see you also next month. This was the last episode of EHEX IO in 2018. So thank you and bye.